evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ohio State Department of History's conference on the Pacific War at 70. My name is Peter Hahn. I am privileged to preside over this conference. I'm a professor of history and Dean of Arts and Humanities here at Ohio State, and I'm very pleased to welcome each and every one of you to this gathering. We're here almost exactly 70 years after the conclusion of World War II in the Pacific to learn from scholars and veterans of that conflict. This conference, and by the way, there's a program of this evening's and tomorrow's activities for you to take a look at. This conference would not have been possible without the wonderful support of the College of Arts and Sciences, Communications Services, and Office of Development and Alumni Relations, as well as the Office of University Advancement, and last but certainly not least, the faculty and staff of the Department of History. We're also very thankful for the donors who have underwritten this conference, whose names are listed on the back of your program. I'd also like to point out John Shackelford, who made a sponsoring gift, which arrived just after the brochure went to press. I'd also like to commemorate the services and sacrifices of veterans of the Second World War. Tomorrow afternoon we're going to have a veterans panel that will feature 3 combat veterans of the Pacific War. All 3 of them are here this evening, and in fact I would like to point them out to you. Gentlemen, you can wave or stand. David Green, a U.S. Marine, and Eugene Vic Smith, also of the United States Marine Corps. They will be featured tomorrow afternoon in the final session at 3:30 p.m. over in the law school. Allow me now to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference, Dr. Williamson Murray. Dr. Murray is an academic program fellow at the Potomac Institute and a professor of history emeritus here at Ohio State. He graduated from Yale University in 1963 with honors in history. He then served for 5 years as an officer in the United States Air Force, including a tour in Southeast Asia. He then returned to Yale, where he earned his PhD in military and diplomatic history. Eventually, he came here to Ohio State, where he taught in those fields for nearly 2 decades. Wick is the author of many acclaimed historical works on topics including World War II, the theory of military history, military innovation, and warfare in the modern world. Dr. Murray's lecture this evening, titled "Preventing the Most Terrible of Wars," will address the question of why the atomic bombs on Japan that were used on Japan in August 1945 were necessary, and explore the potential consequences on Japan and Asia had the bombs not been dropped. Please join me now in welcoming to this podium Dr. Williamson Murray.
Thank you, Peter, for those kind words. I should also mention that I'm connected as adjunct professor, Marshall professor, in fact, at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. Let me make a couple personal comments to begin with. First of all, there are several of my students in here who did not get enough of me when I was teaching. One of them is a justice of the Ohio Supreme Court. The other is Scott Powell, former quarterback of the Ohio State University football team. And of course, one of the things I love to point out to my Marine students and various other students that I teach, that football is still played in Columbus, unlike many other places. The second thing, in terms of bringing back warm memories, is the fact that I had the honor of having lunch with Woody Hayes several times in this club. A man who I got to know after he had been fired as football coach in the last 6 years of his life. A man who I thought enormously well of, and I think it's well worth, in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, noting that Woody Hayes, by 1945, was the executive officer of destroyer escort, was going to be assigned the duty of communication ships off of one of the Marine landings on Kyushu on the 1st of November 1945, and then became captain of the destroyer escort and brought it back to the United States in 1946. And very clearly, Woody and most of the veterans that I've talked to in the Pacific War had no qualms about saying that without dropping the atomic bombs, they would have been killed in the fighting against the Japanese. Let me turn to what I want to talk about in terms of the dropping of the atomic bomb, and start off with last year's Super Bowl, in which innumerable sports writers and sports aficionados and all sort of 82 million people who watched the game immediately raised the question of why did Seattle pass when obviously giving it to Marshawn Lynch would have resulted in a touchdown in Seattle's victory. What of course that missed is the fact that Monday morning quarterbacking, which Woody Hayes absolutely hated, with real reason, is predicated on the belief that had some other course been followed, it would have resulted in a success. And in terms of had last year, had Seattle handed the ball to Marshawn Lynch, and had he fumbled, of course, then all the Monday morning quarterbacks would have said, why didn't Seattle pass on the last thing? And I want to carry that analogy over to what I think we historians and sort of those who critique both military and political policy do more often than not, which is Monday morning quarterbacking. What, of course, they are unwilling to address is the fact that the choices made, had they not been made, might have, well, resulted in something even worse. And they also, again, I think a crucial element, which is quite similar, I think, to Monday morning quarterbacking about football, is the fact that they entirely miss the context within which decisions are made. Football coaches make decisions within sort of 30, 40 seconds, which in terms of a clear, rational thinking process is non-existent. They're reacting on instinct and feeling, and slightly different in terms of decision-making in war, or peace, particularly in terms of war, and that is the context of 1945 is important to understand in the sense that decision-making took place under enormous pressures. The individuals at the top, in terms of the generals and admirals and politicians, including Truman from the point he became president in April 1945, had been working 15, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week with no time off and no time for reflection, and certainly no time to if you will, consider alternatives. And a good example along these lines is that the scientists raised the possibility of before dropping it on a Japanese city, the atomic bomb, that in fact it would have, they suggested might be useful to carry out a test, if you will, on some area that was not Japanese cities, but in fact might be in the countryside, might be in Tokyo Bay. One time I suggested to a Japanese friend they could have dropped it on the top of Mount Fujiyama, which certainly would have been something the Japanese would have had to take notice of. And his comment on that was that would have been an absolute outrage, and we would have much preferred to have a drop on Hiroshima. In fact, the scientists raised a very interesting question, because dropping it as a warning might have been a very useful thing, but they presented it in terms of a warning that was, if you will, given to the Japanese ahead of time. We are going to drop on the Tokyo plain, 10 miles from Tokyo, an atomic bomb, and watch what happens, because we've got a lot more of these suckers, and you better quit. What that missed, and again, this is the pressure of time and the fact that, as I think all of you who have participated in committee meetings know, sometimes the, if you will, the essential question is not asked, which is, why do we have to announce it to the Japanese? That simply having an atomic bomb explode 15 miles from Tokyo would be something that not even they could miss. But nobody asked that question, and so the response to the idea of an announced explosion of a nuclear weapon, atomic weapon, was that we don't know whether it's going to work. And oh, by the way, they really didn't know whether it's going to work. It's worth noting that when it went off at Alamogordo in July of 1945, the fear of some of the atomic scientists, including Oppenheimer, was that it might not work at all, in which case they were going to have a very long and trying time explaining to Congress why $5 billion of U.S. money had gone down the drain to create nothing. Well, they didn't face that, obviously. But there was real fear that the atomic weapon might not work, which would then, if you will, render future use of atomic weapons less scary to the Japanese. I think it's also well, in terms of understanding the context of the time, to note that the intelligence framework within which policymakers were dealing, particularly the military side, never really became open to historians, much less the general public, until the 1990s, when the full list of magic and ultra intercepts and decrypts were released to the general public, and security was taken over them. And I'll explain in a few minutes why that is so important. And finally, let me emphasize that the experiences of American military forces in Iwo Jima, in which a Japanese garrison of about 25,000 inflicted 27,000 casualties on the attacking Marine 5th and 6th Divisions, or for that matter, Okinawa, which came in April 1945, in which ground casualties were in the order of 45,000 plus, and then there were, in addition, 10,000 naval casualties inflicted by the kamikazes, gave policymakers, if you will, a dreadful fear of the kinds of casualties that any kind of major military operations on the home islands would inflict on the American military. So let me lay out, if you will, some of the arguments that historians have suggested as to why we should not have dropped the bomb, and then examine them in detail for their historical validity. And then I'm going to turn to the actual impact of the bomb, say a few comments of that in terms of Japanese policy making, and finally the potential results of what might have happened had we not dropped the bomb, and not just in terms of American casualties, but Japanese and Asian casualties as well. The first argument against dropping the atomic bomb was that Japan was on the brink of surrendering. That its strategic position was hopeless. Blockade, bombing, military defeats had rendered the Japanese into an impossible position, and consequently Japanese leaders realized this and understood it, if you will, the overall strategic situation. My answer to that is yes, but. And the but has to do with the fact that in terms of how the Japanese leadership, military leadership, viewed the world, they viewed it in a very different context than the way we viewed it. They viewed it in terms of honor, Bushido, a sense that it was better to die with honor, even if it took the entire Japanese nation down, than to surrender, if you will, their polity to the American and Allied forces. Again, in terms of the magic military intercepts, it made it clear that not only were the Japanese preparing, if you will, a formidable defense of the home islands, particularly Kyushu, but that they were fully cognizant of the fact that their military position was, from our perspective, hopeless, but that from their position they believed they could inflict terrible, if you will, unacceptable casualties on any Allied forces that attacked. The second argument is that the Japanese were reaching out to Moscow to negotiate an end to the fighting, and that because of the diplomatic decrypts which were released in the 50s, that we knew that the Japanese were considering surrender and paying no attention to it. What this misses, of course, is the fact that the Japanese suggestions to their ambassador in Moscow were so unrealistic and so, if you will, other-earthly, that the Japanese ambassador in Moscow cabled back saying, "You people better wake up because your suggestions have no connection to reality." And even more important, I think, is the fact that who was in charge in Japan. The very fact that the Japanese Foreign Office had to keep their cables to their ambassador in Moscow secret and from the Japanese military, because they were desperately afraid the military would purge them and execute them for betrayal of Japan, for treachery, I think underlines the fact that who was in charge makes a real difference. And in this case, the Japanese military were fully in charge, possessing both the means of suppressing any opposition and any attempt to, if you will, make peace. The next argument is that, in fact, the bomb had no real effect on the Japanese, and that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was the decisive element in terms of Japan's decision to surrender. Very difficult to prove this one is false, except for the fact that on the three crucial occasions in which the emperor mentioned, including his last one where he said to the Japanese why he was in fact considering the, if you will, unacceptable and unbelievable, that of those three occasions, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was only mentioned once. The dropping of the atomic bomb was mentioned in all three occasions, which certainly suggests from his point of view, and the fact that he intervened for reasons which I'll mention in a minute, that in fact the bomb was the essential element. And along these lines, let me say that, by the way, the Japanese were very badly informed about how catastrophic the situation was in Manchuria in terms of Soviet invasion. The Soviet main force, in fact, was backdooring them from outer Mongolia and from northwestern Manchuria, and about to unleash, if you will, a catastrophe in the Japanese military. Tokyo had no real sense of that because Japanese senior commanders on the scene in Manchuria had no real understanding of how badly their military situation was falling apart. Finally, we have the argument that the only reason the United States dropped the bomb was to intimidate the Soviets in the post-war period. And this has appeared innumerable times in, if you will, the revisionist theory that posits that the United States was the cause of the Cold War, not Stalin's Soviet Union. In fact, if you look at the record, the the possible impact on Soviet behavior in the post-war period is mentioned only rarely, and usually in passing, by senior policymakers. And certainly Truman and most of his senior advisors mentioned it not at all. And in fact, a substantial portion of the American military, including General Marshall, were pushing throughout the whole period from the spring of 45 through the summer of 45 for a Japanese, for a Soviet participation in the invasion of Manchuria. The final element, of course, is the idea that the estimate for casualties in the invasion of Kyushu was only approximately about 50,000 American casualties. And here we are dealing with a proportionality argument that, in fact, since probably nearly 200,000 Japanese were killed by the atomic explosions, or at least 150,000, that in fact 50,000 American casualties was worth taking and landing in Kyushu and not dropping the bomb. There's some problems with that. That estimate of 50,000 casualties was made in May of 1945, when there were in fact only about 100,000 Japanese troops in Kyushu. What the magic intercepts indicate is that by July of 1945, there were 450,000 Japanese troops in Kyushu. In other words, the Japanese force structure had increased 350,000 troops, which obviously would have had an enormous impact on the casualty figures. In fact, Macarthur's chief of staff really worried whether an Olympic could even be launched in a ratio in which the landing forces would be a 1-to-1 ratio against the Japanese. So that in fact the Japanese buildup, which actually is even much more than the 400,000, because again, what the ultra decrypts and magic decrypts indicated was that the Japanese were mobilizing their civilian population to carry out, if you will, mass suicide attacks on the U.S. In addition to the fact that, again, Ultra indicated that Japanese had somewhere around 5,000 suicide aircraft, all lined up ready to launch against the invasion fleet. And again, in terms of Japanese plans, against both Okinawa and Iwo Jima, suicide attacks had been aimed at the carriers. This time the Japanese were going to go after hospital ships and troop ships with the aim to impact and kill as many Americans as possible. So what we are dealing with, of course, is that in fact the 50,000 supposed casualties the U.S. would have suffered really doesn't get at the real issue of the fact that those casualty figures, estimates, were no longer relevant. All of this led, interestingly enough, to what I'm going to talk about in a few moments, but the Navy, Admiral Nimitz in particular, only agreed to Olympic, which is the code name for the landing on Kyushu, provisionally. That in fact, he withheld the right of the Navy to withdraw its support for the landing in Kyushu if the Navy felt the casualty figure for Navy, Marines, and Army was going to be too high. Let me turn now to the Japanese and their reaction. Their reaction, of course, to Potsdam, which gave some hint that something really bad was on order and about to happen to them. They basically, for reasons, and again, Americans dealing with 21st century media is not just a 21st century problem. The Japanese response to the Potsdam declaration by Truman was largely driven by Japanese newspapers, whose response came before the government and put the government in a position where had it rejected the newspapers, it would have found itself in very difficult position with substantial elements of the Japanese military. The reaction to the bomb, I think, is rather interesting. Very clearly, the Japanese had no sense of what was coming when Hiroshima was dropped. Significantly, Hiroshima was a significant military target, the headquarters for the Japanese army that was going to carry the defense of Kyushu. The initial Japanese military response was, what bomb? There was a problem with that, which when some people came to look from Tokyo, they couldn't carry that argument much further. So the next argument, which one of the senior naval officers in the, if you will, the crucial war cabinet grouping said was the U.S. could only have one bomb because it's so expensive. And 4 hours later came the news of Nagasaki, which, again, I think it's worth underlining, completely underestimated, completely undermined the military position that, in fact, the bomb was only a one-time threat. In fact, those who favored the possibility of peace in the arguments within the senior Japanese leadership were then able to say, obviously, since Americans have dropped the second one in 4 days, they have innumerable numbers of atomic weapons. In fact, of course, we didn't. Yet I think it's worth noting and underlining that the war cabinet, what we might call the war cabinet, was still divided 3-3. Could not, in other words, make a decision even on their own. And it was, of course, at this point the emperor stepped in, and since my advisors cannot make a decision, I will make the decision, knowing full well that he was putting his life and his family's life at risk. Because the Japanese, it's worth noting, the hotheads in Tokyo did attempt to overthrow the government, did attempt to seize the emperor. Now, I want to turn to what might have happened had the bomb not been dropped. First of all, one of the interesting aspects of, I think, the most important study of the dropping of the bomb by it's worth noting, a non-academic historian who has done a huge amount of research, Richard Frank, in a book called Downfall, has managed to uncover the fact, as I said, the Navy was about to withdraw its support for Limerick. Basically to say, we cannot afford to do a landing, given our experiences on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, that in fact the only thing we can do is to execute a long-term blockade and starve the Japanese into a position where they'll have to surrender. That food fight, of course, between the Navy and the Army led by Macarthur never happened because, of course, the bomb was dropped. So what might have happened if the bomb had not been dropped? Beyond that, if you will, huge blow-up among the American military about what needed to be done. What's interesting is that the first sections of what became known as the Strategic Bombing Survey in Europe had been completed by the summer of 1945, and one of the things the Strategic Bombing Survey estimated was that the bombing of Germany's transportation network had proven far more critical to the defeat of Germany than the bomber barons had thought during the conduct of the war. And that news came at precisely the time in early August of 1945 that LeMay had just about run out of cities to destroy, quite literally. The only major cities were Hiroshima, parts of Nagasaki, and of course Kyoto, which the Secretary of War Stimson had protected, and thank goodness for that. What LeMay's planners then decided the next target set would be the transportation network in Japan to destroy that. And that campaign would have begun sometime between the 15th of August and the 25th of August of 1945. That would have been a catastrophe for Japan, because Japan's transportation network would have been very easy to take out. But the consequences, the long-term consequences for Japan in the next 2 or 3 years would have been catastrophic. Japanese were at this time on a starvation diet of about 1,200 calories a day. Occasionally when I try and go on a diet, I go to 1,200 calories and have a nervous breakdown. But they had been on for about a year on somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 calories. They were quite literally at starvation's door. In late 1945, in fact, and I think this is worth remembering MacArthur for, there is in history, unlike what my colleague Alan Millett suggested about MacArthur being the fount of all evil, an enemy of the Marine Corps, Alan Millett missed that there was also at times a good MacArthur. And in late 1945, early 46, MacArthur sent a note to Truman saying, if you don't give really substantial food aid, massive food aid, we will lose 2 to 3 million Japanese starving to death. And do you want to be known, Americans to be known for the starvation of, if you will, millions of Japanese, given what we understand the Germans did to the Jews and others. In the U.S., and there was considerable political opposition to this, the U.S. stepped in and supplied the food for Japan in 1946 and 1947 that kept Japan from starving to death. 2 to 3 million. Had the transportation network been taken out, there would have been no way to get that food to substantial portions of the Japanese population. And so one of the unintended effects of not dropping the bomb, even if the Japanese had surrendered 2 or 3 months later, would have been the mass starvation of the Japanese population. Now there's something which, because most of the Americans focus on, if you will, the ending of the war has aimed at, if you will, U.S. efforts and Japanese efforts. And Max Hastings, in his book on the ending of the Second World War, a really massive, impressive book, points out that in fact there were enormous numbers of death occurring in the rest of Asia in the summer of 1945, probably somewhere between 10 and 15,000 deaths a day in places like China, in places like Southeast Asia, Borneo, New Guinea, and every day that the war continued was going to be and provide a larger and larger casualty bill of civilian deaths in the rest of Asia. Again, something which the historians who argue against the bomb argue against. Now, Frank argues on the basis of his research that the Navy might well, given the fact that Truman was the last American president to really face ground combat, that Truman would have probably come down on the side of the Navy, and Olympic might never have been launched. What he leaves out of that is that the Soviets in mid-August 1945 attacked the Sakhalin Islands and the Kuril Islands. They were prepared to attack Hokkaido. And my guess is that had Soviets launched in September 1945 a landing in Hokkaido, we would have gone forward with Kyushu for political reasons. And the result would have been an unmitigated bloodbath. I think there's one final comment you can make about the dropping of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's very clear that when the bomb was dropped, even the scientists had no real understanding of the huge dangers that radiation represented. There is a case in 1947-48 where some scientists at Los Alamos were playing around with uranium, sort of a couple globs of uranium, and pushed them to see how close they could get them together with no protective gear on or anything. And literally they got a chain reaction in the room which ended up killing about 5 or 6 of them. So the knowledge even of the scientists of the dangers of radiation. It is very clear that the secondary effects in terms of radiation death began to become apparent in Japan in the period at the end of the 40s into the 1950s. And I would argue that if you will, knowledge of the dangers that radiation carried with it beyond, if you will, simply watching stuff explode, were such that it introduced, if you will, into the Cold War, a certain amount of caution among the policymakers in Washington and the Soviet Union. Again, no way to prove that. It's just a supposition by me. So, bottom line, and let me mention something for those of you who are become interested in this subject. The Frank book would certainly be worth reading. But there's a wonderful PBS 3-hour documentary that's called Victory in the Pacific that was done about 7 or 8 years ago that begins with truly unbelievable footage. The footage is taken by U.S. Navy cameramen, is of somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Japanese civilians jumping off the cliffs at Saipan to commit suicide rather than to fall under the Americans. And it, again, in terms of the discussion, and it's worth noting the significant number of Japanese historians participated in the discussions in the Victory of the Pacific, that I would argue you have a pretty hard time in believing that the dropping of the atomic bomb was not a, if you will, useful thing. A good thing, given the horrors of killing of hundreds of thousands of people, it's hardly a good thing. But in terms of something that prevented a far worse catastrophe for the human race, and particularly in Asia and Japan, I think it's a moment in which you understand that in fact there are no easy solutions in history, that sometimes policymakers confront really nasty, dark truths. And one just hopes that in the 21st century no one confronts the issues of dropping nuclear weapons. So let me stop there and take any questions you have. Yes, ma'am.
Could you repeat the two?
You have to speak up because I lost one hearing aid in Normandy. Not because anybody was shooting at me, but because it got rained on.
If you were in Normandy, why are you talking about Japan? No, I would like you to repeat the two books that you mentioned, Frank and...
Richard Frank, and the very simple title is Downfall.
And Max somebody?
Max Hastings, and I believe it's
Retribution.
Retribution.
Thank you.
Max Hastings' Retribution. Max Hastings also wrote a superb history of the ending of the Second World War, where Nazi Germany's leaders did take their nation down to complete defeat, to the point where the Soviets, in taking Berlin in 1945, suffered 150,000 plus casualties. From Stalin's point of view, that was small change. From democracy's point of view, which believes in, if you will, the sanctity of its soldiers' lives, if necessary. That kind of, if you will, confronting that kind of ruthlessness is a real problem.
Thank you.
No more? Yes?
I had read a couple places where they had estimated that the casualties that American forces would suffer would be approximately 1 million. And the fact that you mentioned 50,000 comes as a surprise.
There were some sort of numbers thrown around by individuals, but the only serious, if you will, study that was done in terms of staff estimating casualties was done by Macarthur's staff in May of 1945 with an estimate of approximately 40 to 50,000 casualties. That's, of course, before the massive Japanese buildup began. No major staff study looking at that issue. People threw out numbers, which I think are pretty unreliable. Again, if you compare the number of U.S. troops casualties suffered at Okinawa and Iwo Jima to the number of Japanese on that, having 400,000 and having the task of digging 450,000 Japanese out of Kyushu is really a nasty, formidable task. Yes, ma'am. That's way back there.
Thanks. Hi, Rick. I have a question as to, thank you so much for this wonderful overview of all of the questions around the dropping of the atomic bomb. I was wondering what your response would be to the arguments that U.S. decision-making was, I don't want to say marred because you've convinced me that it was the right decision to drop the bomb, but that U.S. decision-making was influenced by a lack of human resources, human intelligence resources in Japan, that the United States, while excelling in terms of signals intelligence, was lacking in any real ability to understand decision-making within Japan because of the dearth of human intelligence resources in their decision-making for dropping the bomb.
I think that's an extraordinarily good point. Our problem, of course, is that Japan represented, I would argue, as opaque a culture in terms of American understanding as ISIS does today. That the culture of Japan was known to only a very few Americans, and worked both ways, because the Japanese totally underestimated us, as did the Germans. They had no understanding of what we were capable of, or they never would have started the bloody war. And look, given the fact that we're not much better at it today, the fact that they got some things right in 45 suggests a great deal more about their, if you will, sophistication than our sophistication in the 21st century. But of course, nobody in the 21st century reads any history anymore, so why would we be more sophisticated? Yes, sir.
Again, thank you for this wonderful overview. Had the Russians not declared war on the Japanese, do you feel the emperor would have continued the fighting or not?
I think he very clearly would have surrendered. I think that the atomic bomb and the fact that we had dropped 2 in succession suggested that we had a whole bunch of these. We didn't. We were going to be able to drop 1 more at the end of August, and then we weren't going to drop any more because Marshall was saving them up. And think this went through. The U.S. Army was saving them up as tactical weapons to be used in the landing at Kyushu, which would have, in terms of radiation fallout, been a catastrophe for landing U.S. troops. Again, it wasn't Marshall was stupid. It was just we didn't know how dangerous this stuff was. How dangerous this stuff was is my wife and I went to the Orkneys 2 years ago and stayed in a bed and breakfast where the man of the house was a deep diver and was participating in efforts to cut German armor off of some of the battle cruisers and battleships that were still so deep that nobody had tried to salvage them. The reason they were doing this is that, in fact, the steel off the armor plating was more valuable than platinum because it had not been the only place in the world where you can get steel that's not been contaminated by the fallout that began to occur from 1945 on.
I'm confused. Maybe it's me, but you say that the emperor would have continued the war?
No, I said he would not have. I think he would have, that the threat of the two bombs was such. Again, one has to understand Japanese decision-making, both his statements and, if you will, the fact that very clearly the three senior officials, 2 civilians and 1 military, who voted for accepting the Potsdam Declaration with the understanding that the emperor would remain as emperor, you would have had a decision-making body that was split, and that again gave the emperor, in terms of his prerogatives, the chance to step in. And I think, having seen what the Americans had done to Tokyo in March of 1945, I think he would have used that opportunity. So my sense is that the atomic bombs were the crucial element. Yes, sir.
Is there any reason to believe that things might have been different if Roosevelt had survived and Truman was not making the decision?
No, I don't think there would have been any difference at all. Roosevelt was the one that put the atomic program in motion. In fact, Truman, interestingly enough, did not find out about specifically did not find out about it, was not told directly until he became president. He knew something was occurring because, as the head of the Senate committee and checking on government waste in 43 and 44, he was the head of that committee, somewhere, somehow, $2 to $3 billion have disappeared. And he was told by Marshall, don't ask where. It's being used for a legitimate purpose. And again, Harry Truman was a patriot, and that was enough for him. Again, very different attitude that we get today in terms of most senators. Yeah.
Let me ask another hypothetical. Is there any reason to believe the fact that Stalin knew about the bomb, that he did his attack on Japan, and his actions were different than they would have been had he not known?
No, I think he was, we had encouraged him to do that. He looked at this as a wonderful opportunity to pay the Japanese back for 1905, because it was a sense of nationalism in Stalin as well as communist belief. So they wanted to get Sakhalin back. They would have been delighted. They did get the Kuril Islands. In the 1990s, one of my Japanese friends said, the idiots we have running the business in Tokyo right now are making desperate attempts to get it back, and if the Russians were smart, they could get a lot of money out of the guys running Tokyo today. But he said, my generation, forget them. They're a bunch of rocks in the Pacific that aren't worth anything. I think it was looking at Manchuria. Particularly, the Japanese had done an enormous amount of buildup in terms of Manchuria, so Stalin was looking at grabbing, if you will, Japanese resources in Manchuria and probably taking over Manchuria as sort of a semi-colony, because he did not expect that Mao Zedong was going to win. When Mao Zedong's victory in 49 caused Stalin a lot of embarrassment and annoyance, because he then had to turn Manchuria over to the Chinese communists. Got one behind you.
Another what if. FDR, I understand, at Casablanca, without telling Churchill, said that we're going to demand unconditional surrender of all the Axis powers. I think that surprised Churchill a lot. If he just would have said surrender the Axis powers, do you think the war would have ended a lot earlier? If it could have been some things like keeping the Japanese royal family in power?
No, from the point of view of the Germans, given the extent of their war crimes that the generals had enthusiastically joined in, they were going to go down to defeat with Hitler because the consequences of surrendering to the Allies were so enormous. So I don't think unconditional surrender had any effect on that. From the Japanese point of view, again, misunderstanding the Americans and the ruthlessness with which, when we really get annoyed, and you know, we've been really annoyed twice in our history. The North in the Civil War got really annoyed, and when it was over, there was nothing left of the South. Nothing. Having watched the Germans escape the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, this time we were going to dictate peace on German and Japanese territory. No ifs, ands, or buts. That was Roosevelt's attitude. That was the attitude of most Americans who had not wanted to get in the war to begin with, which, again, one of the ironies, of course, of the war is that the main issue that propelled the United States to fight the kind of war it did was the enormous tactical success the Japanese had at Pearl Harbor.
Was it possible for the Soviet Union to invade Hokkaido at the time?
Excuse me?
Was it possible for the Soviet Union to invade Hokkaido at the time?
I think what we would have ended up with if the Russians had seized Hokkaido would have been what we got with East Germany and West Germany, which is a divided Japan with quite serious political consequences for Japan's recovery.
The question was it possible?
Was it possible? Yes. Partially driven by the fact that it's not that the Soviets had a huge amphibious capability. What the Japanese, by focusing on Kyushu, had something like only 2 divisions in Hokkaido. So there's virtually no defenses to defend, although, as usual, the Japanese would have put up fanatical resistance. But of course, that was something that the Soviets were used to, having dealt with German fanatical resistance. So I think there was a real chance that the Soviets would have grabbed Hokkaido. In fact, only at the last moment in mid-August, Stalin called off the invasion because he was afraid that it would annoy the Americans.
There's a question I've kind of wondered about for some time. Is it true that Truman's reaction to Joe Stalin at Potsdam when he told him of this powerful weapon was any evidence that Joe Stalin already knew all about it?
Well, it's very clear Stalin knew all about it, and Stalin didn't say, I know all about what you guys have been doing. Stalin just said, you know, basically, you know, pay seemingly no attention. Worth noting that Beria was already at work trying to collect German scientists and the engineering and resources to build their own bomb. They knew what was going on in the United States because of a brilliant espionage effort.
So it's correct then that Truman understood at that time that, hey, this guy knows all about this thing I'm telling you about?
No, I don't think Truman was puzzled by the fact that Stalin didn't seem to take this as any big deal. He couldn't understand it. It became clear when the Soviets exploded their first bomb in 1949. Then I think Truman knew why Stalin had not been particularly impressed.
I'm just going to make an intervention here. The Ultra project cracked more than the German codes. We cracked the Russian codes too. And sometime after Potsdam, we were intercepting Soviet cable traffic to and from their spies in the Manhattan Project, among them Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted and hung as spies, and everyone said, oh, what a travesty, they were framed. And in the 90s, of course, their encrypted messages to Moscow were released to the public in National Archives. It's what the government used in their trial. But of course, they couldn't say that we were reading the Soviet traffic because we didn't want the Soviets to know. So at some point, it became clear that there was a massive spy ring inside the Manhattan Project, led by Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and they were hung justly so as spies.
Thank you.
Gerhard Weinberg says it best that throughout the Second World War, everybody was reading everybody else's mail. It was how successful you were at interpreting and understanding what, because again, the picture of Ultra is that it tells you everything. It doesn't tell you everything. It tells you bits and pieces because the traffic between Japanese officers or German officers, they knew most of the context within which the message was occurring. And to understand the message, you had to understand the context within which the message was occurring, and lots of times we did not. And lots of times the Germans were much worse at that because they had if you will, a fundamental contempt for their opponents and a belief in their own superiority that was not well placed.
I have a question about the occupation of Japan. Was that a purely military effort, or what actually happened after the war, after surrender, and America occupied Japan?
We occupied Japan with substantial military forces. The initial sort of contact between us and the Japanese is clear. The Japanese were prepared for us to act like true barbarians. And I don't mean in the sense of bringing rock music and chewing gum. But they fully expected that we would do what they had done to the Japanese, and we did not. We were also helped by the fact that the good Macarthur was an extraordinarily effective and nuanced chief of American occupation, and dealt very well with the emperor and with Japanese politicians. I think in retrospect, we were probably a little too nice to the Japanese, just like we were much too nice to the Germans after the war, but it reflected the fact that we faced an existential threat in terms of the Soviet Union.
I've always been interested when I hear historians say that history always repeats itself. One of the words that you have mentioned is fanaticism. And people who feel fanatic about something will tend to sacrifice their lives for their own causes. Does your experience as a historian bring up into the 21st century that same subject? Are we missing something right now that's going to protect us from World War III in the future?
What will protect us from World War III is that as long as the great powers, and in terms of the great first world powers, I put the United States, China, and the EU as a conglomerate, and probably on the fringes Japan and the East Asian tigers. I don't see a major war, because I think we all understand what we would lose by that. There'll be posturing, it could be mistakes. The great danger we confront right now is the fact that there are, I would argue, a considerable danger of a massive religious war in the Middle East. An India-Pakistan situation in which if a conflict breaks out because of something like the Mumbai attack sponsored by the Pakistani intelligence agency, you'll get major exchange of nuclear weapons, which, oh, by the way, in terms of the fallout, will affect us all. Again, I think you have to understand, I would say history doesn't repeat itself. I'd like to use Mark Twain's comment, history rhymes. History rhymes. And so if you, again, in a piece that I wrote on the importance of history, I argued that history is important for giving us a sense of where we stand and why we stand in a particular position, what the context is. And if you don't have a historical background of where we stand and where, if you will, the other stands, then in fact any road to the future will do. And that's the danger for, I would argue, for an American polity in which history is being trashed from the high schools through the universities.
Discuss a little bit about the mindset of Macarthur at the surrender ceremony and that whole ceremony itself.
Yeah, the band Macarthur made an appearance in July and August of 1945 because he was arguing that, in fact, the casualty estimates of 50,000 were accurate, and even the sycophants and his staff were saying, "Oh, no, boss, doesn't look that way." I think his comments at the surrender ceremony, in terms of if you will, a generous effort to reach out to the defeated as well as to the Allies, was really quite extraordinary. And again, it reflected the fact that he now took on the, as some historians have argued, I think quite accurately, the guise of the new shogun, which he loved. The problem was the Korean War came along, and he did, the good Macarthur appeared at Incheon to be immediately replaced by the idiot who went to the Yalu. We got one way back there.
Two questions. Is it true that Roosevelt feared that the Germans were starting the development of the atomic bomb? And the other question is that, is it also true that Macarthur, in his position as the commander in Japan, in so many words told these Soviets that they would get a part of Japan as part of their, as reward for coming into Manchuria over my dead body? Are those true?
The first is that we were really very worried the Japanese were going to get the Germans were going to get the bomb first, because they had, if you will, the lead in terms of scientific expertise that should have enabled them to develop the bomb. The problem was the Germans, helped, I think deliberately by the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, made some bad calculations which suggested that it was going to prove too expensive. And here you come into the fact that Nazi Germany simply did not have the resources to put into something like the making of the atomic bomb that we did. And again, this reflected the enormous power and strength of the U.S. economy, which the Germans didn't understand. MacArthur's attitude towards Manchuria, he wasn't asked about Manchuria because his business was Okinawa, Philippines, Okinawa, and preparing for the invasion of Japan. Manchuria and getting the Soviets in the war was entirely the business of Truman and Marshall and people in Washington. Now, MacArthur was perfectly capable of saying any stupid thing that went into his mind, so he may well have said it, but he knew full well that he was not going to be involved in that decision-making process.
Apropos the good MacArthur and the bad MacArthur, comment as you wish, but there is a thesis that MacArthur got along so well with the Emperor because both he and the Emperor were semi-divine beings.
I should point out that my former colleague, both at the Air University and here at Ohio State, Joe Martin just made that comment, winner of 2 Silver Stars. So in terms of heroes in this room, Joe is certainly one of them. I think we have a question over here.
You had talked about us breaking the Japanese code. Is there any evidence that they had success in breaking our codes?
They broke a little bit. In fact, the Japanese intelligence wasn't quite as bizarrely wrong as some historians have suggested. But they weren't terribly good because they didn't put the resources in it, just the way the Germans. The crucial part is not just breaking the codes, but then having an intelligence organization with the language knowledge to put messages into context, the way we managed to, for example, in terms of the Midway, with very relatively small pieces of information, we figured out that the target was Midway, and we were right. It wasn't sort of a massive number of decrypts that enabled us to get that. I think right now our difficulty is we can decrypt anything and anyone. We can intercept any message, and we have 18 billion a day that we get, and we can't figure out what they mean. Better to have too little information and people who understand the other than to have masses of information. Got another one over here.
Tagging along with the Douglas MacArthur good and bad scenario, your opinion, dialing back a bit on the timeline from August of '45, your opinion as to the necessity or the lack thereof of the butcher shop that was the campaign on Peleliu.
Peleliu was a disaster that shouldn't have been done. But I think the excuse is that you're dealing with people who were making decisions on the basis of you've got only a matter of days, if sometimes maybe a week, to make crucial decisions. Everybody's exhausted. You've been working 15, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And Peleliu was a mistake. There's no doubt about it. We did not need to do it. In fact, I think the evidence is very clear, and this is where having somebody on the staff who's occasionally arrested is a really smart thing to do. Because the place to go when Peleliu was done was Iwo. Because Iwo was not prepared, and the Japanese were not prepared because the Japanese fleet was off Borneo. And so grabbing Iwo would have cost us very few casualties in September of 1944 as opposed to what Peleliu cost. Peleliu was a terrible mistake. You make mistakes in war. It's inevitable in terms of the context of ambiguity and uncertainty, weariness, and all of those sort of factors that I suggested.
I forgot to mention the Japanese didn't do very well at breaking the code talkers in Navajo Indian language.
Yeah, I mean, again, we were, of course, copying the Brits in the First World War, who used Indian from India, not American India, but Indians from India speaking Urdu or a variety of the other tongues on the Western Front because Germans didn't have anybody who could understand what they were saying.
I've heard it said that the Germans had wonderful tactics, but terrible strategy in World War II. What would you say about the Japanese in terms of their tactics or strategy? Were either one of them any good?
Well, tactically, and actually there's a very good book that's come out by an American who's a professor in a British university, which should say a lot about the fact that we don't do military history except at Ohio State anymore in the United States, which points out that in fact the Japanese at the end of the war were doing some incredibly sophisticated technological things, like the Frank fighter may well have been the finest fighter of the Second World War, piston engine fighter. And that their capabilities in terms of being able to do stuff might have suggested to some Americans in 45, 46 when peace came that these guys would be serious competitors in terms of economic competition to make cars and stuff like that. But of course, GM laughed at them when the first Toyota arrived, and we know the result of that.
Could you just address the effect on the Japanese with the death of Yamamoto, Ishiruko Yamamoto?
Yeah, the effect on the Japanese of the death of Yamamoto, pretty insignificant, because by that point, the Japanese situation was hopeless, although if Yamamoto, rather than, and I forget the name of the guy who was on the fleet that broke through at Leyte Gulf, if Yamamoto had been there, I think it would have destroyed everything within reach, that Yamamoto would not have turned or run away anyway. But again, that wouldn't have made any difference. We would have just made another, we were turning out, as we could say, we were turning out Liberty ships like candy bars. You know, we managed to build a 10,000-ton Liberty ship in one day. Now, I have to tell you, we cheated. We got every single piece and 24 hours of workers and all planned out just to prove, this is so American, just to prove that you could build a Liberty ship in a day. It was sheer and utter nonsense because it was probably wasted a lot of resources that could have been better used. And so instead of that, in the shipyard, in the 2-month period, instead of producing 10 Liberty ships, they probably only produced 8. But they got one of those took one day, and so that got advertised in Life magazine.
I was in Washington, D.C. and picked up a book about the American Museum of History. E.B. Sledge called it with the Old Breed, and it's a guy in the 1st Marine Division in the Pacific. And it's unfortunately, people don't read those in college and high school. His perspective on war as a grunt, you know, it's fascinating reading.
There are, I would argue, 2 or 3, if you will, memoirs of the First World War. I think the 2 best of them are, as you said, E.B. Sledge's With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa. The second is by the guy who wrote the Flashman novels. It's called Quartered Safe Out Here. Was a Lance Corporal in Slim's 14th Army. The difference between the 2, and I have my Marine captains in a seminar that I teach at Quantico, read the Quartered Safe Out Here, because Quartered Safe Out Here captures, if you will, the parts in between the horror of. I mean, Sledge talks a little bit about the 1st Marine Division between Peleliu and Okinawa, but it's not in any great depth, whereas, and the combat is nothing but grim, dark discussion of what he went through. The Fraser McDonald book carries out the fact that even in combat, about 85% of a soldier's time is spent in non-combat duties, and some of it's really hilarious. And he had a capacity to capture the, if you will, the inane, sometimes very funny things that happen to human beings in such circumstances. So I put that as the other one, but certainly Sledge is worth reading.
Another 30-second intervention. You said undergraduates don't read it. Well, E.B. Sledge With the Old Breed is required reading in my course on World War II, and on Dr. Bruno Caban, next to me, the Dunn Chair, his course on War and World History, 1900 to the present. So they do read it here at the Ohio State University.
Hello everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you that this is my first history seminar, and I'm from Korea. 2 months ago I came to Columbus, and then it is very interesting to hear all the experts' opinions on Japanese colonial rule and the Hiroshima bomb, because me as a Korean, that we grew up listening to very different perspectives, because the Hiroshima bomb was dropped on August 15th, 1945, and then actually Koreans celebrate that day as a Liberation Day, because that was the very day that we were liberated from Japan. But then that being said, it was a very tragic accident, I think. But some of the gentlemen mentioned that nowadays, history doesn't repeat and they will run. But then what's going on in Korea, China, and Japan these days, when you listen to news, then it seems like the history will definitely repeat, because the nationalism talks and the tensions are rising. Just as a normal citizen, I feel like, oh my goodness, this is a time that I should study history again. So my question for you is that, as an expert in historians, could you tell us the public sentiment at that time of the US and the Japan? Was the public really Japan, or was the public America, or it was just a part of America who decided, or the part of Japan decided, if there was a disconnect between the voice of the leadership at that time or just the voice of the public? And how do you reconcile that?
Give me a little help, Peter. My hearing isn't on.
To what extent did the publics influence the leaders' decisions at the end of the war in America and Japan? I think that's...
The Japanese public played no role, because the Japanese decision makers had no interest in having the public play any role. Clearly the decision was entirely driven by the emperors. And the pictures of the Japanese public when the emperor for the first time spoke, so his subjects could hear him in a ancient, if you will, court form of Japanese, it was devastating to the Japanese public. And I think to a great extent it reflected the fact that their opinion of the world was molded by, if you will, the government's propaganda and belief that the Americans were barbarians who were going to come and kill all the Japanese and rape all the women and destroy Japanese life and culture forever. And of course that's why Macarthur, in the form of occupation that we took, surprised, I think, most Japanese. U.S. Very much of a, if you will, more of influenced by public opinion. And one of the arguments made is that by those who think we shouldn't have dropped the bomb is that, for 45,000 casualties, Japan would have surrendered, we would have won Olympic, and we wouldn't have had to drop the bomb. What, as John Gaddis has pointed out, what that misses is the American people, if they discovered that they'd suffered 45,000 casualties, about 20,000 or 15,000 American soldiers, Marines, and sailors killed in a landing at Kyushu, and the president had refused to drop the bomb, President Truman would have been impeached. Just absolutely no doubt about that, because the population was still unbelievably, and I think the best word to describe it is racist in terms of the attitude toward the Japanese. Outraged, particularly the fact that the Japanese had taken a 2x4 and hit us in the side of the head in December 1941. And that was unacceptable from the American point of view. And so there was substantial opposition to the American decision to allow the emperor to remain on the throne in Japan. If you had taken a public opinion poll in the United States in September of 1945, most people would have voted to hang the emperor.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking that. Our conference will resume tomorrow morning. Coffee will be available at 8:30. The first paper will be delivered at 9 a.m. You're all welcome to attend. Encouraged to attend. Please make note that it is not in this room, but it's in Brinko Hall, Saxby Auditorium. That's at the OSU Law School, just to the east along High Street. Hope to see you tomorrow morning. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.